Hello all, and welcome to this seminar titled The Body of the Nation. My name is Jonna, and I'll be chairing today's talk. And for today's seminar, we are delighted to have with us Professor Franck Billé. Franck Billé is an anthropologist and geographer working at the intersection of cartography, sovereignty, and territoriality at the University of California, Berkeley. His research interest has led to a number of book projects organized around the theoretical foci of the volumetric, the corporeal, and the topological. His most recent books include Nationalism States, Sovereignty, Materiality, and the Territorial Imagination, published in 2020, On the Edge, Life Along the Russia-China Border, with Caroline Humphrey, published in 2021, and Writing in the Negative Space of the State, 2024, and Somatic States, his latest book on cartography, geobodies, bodily integrity, published in 2025. So Professor Billé's talk will take around 40 minutes, and after that, there will be time for your questions. Please note that this seminar will be recorded, so it would be great if you could mute yourself and switch off your camera unless you're talking during the Q&A section. So now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Professor Billé.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joanna, and thank you, Marco, for inviting me. I'm very, very happy to be talking today. I'm going to try and target 40 minutes for the talk. So I'll talk today on my last book, Somatic States, which is published in April. There is, of course, not enough time to go over the whole book, so I'll briefly discuss the core questions that drove the project, and then we'll dive in on a couple of strands of the book's argument, which I think resonate with the current moment. I will try not to speak for too long, so we have a bit of time for questions and discussion. So in this project, which I've focused on for about a decade, my driving question has been to understand the attachment people have to their nation's borders, even when it concerns seemingly minute slivers of land. I will start this talk with recent examples that illustrate the current affective significance of borders. This poster, "China cannot lose an inch," is a political slogan that emerged in mainland China in July 2016 to protest the South China Sea arbitration case. I want to draw your attention here to the word inch, which makes a striking contrast with the size of China. China's expansive footprint in South China Sea is a well-known case. Another example, less well-known, which was in fact one of the points of the departure for the project, are the small islands located on the river separating China from Russia. Clashes over the Damansky Island in the 1960s led to the Sino-Soviet split and to the complete closure of the border. It was agreed in 1991 that the island would be ceded to China, but two unresolved disputes still remained: Bolshoy-Ussurisk Island and Tarabarov Island, located near the Russian city of Khabarovsk. The two governments of China and Russia finally came to an agreement in 2004, after long talks from which their respective citizens were excluded. In both countries, the two islands had played a major symbolic role, and the compromises made by China and by Russia and China were widely perceived on both sides as a betrayal and admission of defeat. This last example showed that border disputes about small slivers of territory are not the exclusive domain of China. Russia, the largest country on earth, is not immune. The Kuril Islands is an example. While there is a sense by analysts that these disputes are predicated on economics and geopolitics, and of course, there is a certain material value to them in terms of the fish stocks around the islands. These explanations, just based in material advantages, oversimplify the issue. The economic fallout of territorial disputes often far exceeds any potential benefits. The lack of a Russian-Japanese resolution over the Kuril Islands has embittered relations between the two countries, leading their economic relations to stagnate. And the third example I want to give is India, where we have the linchpin of the current conflict between India and Pakistan in the snowy waste of Siachen, the Himalayan peak, as iconic as it is unfit for human life, and where 97% of the soldiers killed since 1984 were killed by the weather and the terrain rather than the other side. So these issues are seen in all countries, but in the case of large countries, I think it's especially striking. It's another interesting dimension of these disputes is that these narratives are not simply a top-down discourse. There is considerable popular engagement, at times in ways that really hinder the resolution. And this, I think, might be a good starting point to think about the current significance of borders. Another might be the quote by Donald Trump that we don't have a country if we don't have borders. This is especially relevant in the current US context, of course, but again, it is something we see globally. Migration is a hot button issue in the UK, as well as in most of Europe and beyond. It is one of the key drivers of populism. It is used strategically for political motives by various actors, but what interests me especially is why it is so effective. Geographer Elizabeth Valley has documented the recent proliferation of border walls, currently standing at 74 worldwide, the majority of them erected over the last 2 decades. And we can see a spike in the last few years in particular. And if no continent has been spared this fortification, the US-Mexico border is perhaps the most emblematic. Around 458 miles of new or replacement walls were built during Donald Trump's first presidency. While in the first year of the second term, the federal government has awarded construction contracts worth $4.5 billion. Again, a level of investment that seems at odds with whatever danger they are erected to protect against. Yes, yeah, what is fascinating for me is that borders are quite new. There's something even people working on borders are occasionally surprised to discover. Another ubiquitous trait is the somatization of the state, the framing of the state as a body. This is tied to the enmeshment of the concept of state and nation, which I will discuss later, and I will use both terms interchangeably in this talk. While this framing highlights is an identification of individuals with their nation at a visceral level. In my research, I was interested in the metaphors that mobilize corporeal terms such as mutilation, strangulation, illness, death. My preliminary focus was Russia, so I was very grateful to come across this book by Andras Musov, which is a large-scale study confirming my suspicion that this was a global narrative, not limited to a region of the world. The book traces the metaphor of the nation as body through 30 linguistic and cultural contexts. So not just Europe, but also the Middle East and East Asia. And he identifies 5 main similes. Some of the metaphors he gives are examples as examples are fossilized metaphors, such as head of state, organs of the state. The fact that they are fossilized and therefore unreflected does not mean they are ineffectual. On the contrary, they can come to structure and mold the way of thinking in ways that are invisible and naturalized. Metaphors, after all, are not just poetic devices, but the way we apprehend and conceptualize the world. So when something is seemingly universal, like what I've been talking about so far, it can appear as self-evident and unworthy of scholarly involvement. In my project, I was interested to track the origin of these metaphors and better understand why they feel so visceral and are immediately understood across cultures. So I've raised two interrelated questions so far, which my talk will address. One is why there is such an important focus on borders. And the second is why corporeal framings are so ubiquitous. The two answers are connected to 2 sea changes that we've witnessed in Europe and beyond. Over the last century, we witnessed a shift of sovereignty from radial to homogeneous and evenly operative. Previously, sovereignty was articulated around the body of the monarch or ruler, creating realms that with frayed edges and overlapping forms of sovereignty, non-continuous realms. These monarchs were bestowing plots of lands on nobility, leading to enclaves and exclaves, kind of having, as a result, this kind of Swiss cheese geography. Today, enclaves are very much exceptions and are seen as problematic and anachronistic. When I mean evenly operative, I mean that the rules, rights, taxation regimes, etc., have the same valence throughout the state. As a result, borders have turned into an ambiguous line of separation and have become iconic. From a nucleus surrounded by a set of expanding zones, the nation-state now conceptually resembles an exoskeleton. A consequence of this imaginary of the nation-state as a container and of borders as unambiguous lines of demarcation is an unparalleled significance of edges and corners. The middle has become irrelevant as a marker of sovereignty. The edge has become a condensation of the whole. So from here, we only need a small additional step to get to the idea of the fetish. The satirical short story The Nose by Nikolai Gogol tells the story of Major Kovalyov, who one day awakens to discover his nose is missing. In his analysis of the story, everything okay? Sorry, I heard something. In his analysis of the story, Alexander Etkin equates the lost appendage with a fetish. When in its proper place, the nose is just a little part of Kovalyov's wholeness, a metonymy of his impeccable functioning as a corporeal and imperial subject. Lost, the nose turns into the all-embracing symbol for Kovalyov's unaccomplished dreams and aspirations, the summary metaphor for all those goods, bodies, and statuses, which are unreachable for the noseless. The part is made into a fetish only after it has been lost. Just like Kovalyov's nose in Gogol's short story, whose sudden disappearance turns it from a small component of a larger whole into a site of unrivaled significance, each small island or peak on a nation's border has the potential to transform into a condensed symbol of the nation itself. The two islands of Bolshoy-Ussurisk and Tarabarov, discussed earlier, acted for China precisely as Kovalyov's nose did for him, their reintegration into the national map, signaling a recomposition of the country's national shape. The concept of body politic was popularized in Europe through many texts in the Middle Ages and later by writers such as John of Salisbury, Thomas Aquinas, Shakespeare, and Hobbes, but its origins go back to a much earlier period, to the writings of Plutarch and to Aesop's tale, The Belly and the Members. It also shares more than a passing resemblance to stories and myth found in other parts of the world. These works sought to delineate, through organic corporeal analogies, the responsibilities of rulers and the relationship to their subjects. Later writings codified this relationship more precisely, typically with the king as head, or soul, in the case of Hobbes' Leviathan, and the populace as the body. Varying from one political regime to another, analogies were then extended, with the legal system assimilated to the body's nerve, for instance, the military to his arms, and so on. The cartographic transformation from royal space to a space organized around the citizens can also be traced here through the body politic analogy. The medieval view of the Christian church as a body headed by Christ gave way to the idea of the feudal society as a body with Christ's representative, the Pope, Emperor, or King, as its head. Later, the understanding of the king as possessing both a sacred and a physical body, his body politic and body natural, shifted to the idea of the state itself as a body politic, and eventually the nation, that is, its citizen as a whole, taking on that role. So I've given examples from England, but we can also see this shift happening elsewhere. In India, we encounter what Sumati Ramaswamy describes as barefoot cartography, where state cartography was supplemented with anthropomorphic, devotional, and maternal images, and typically portrayed the national logo map as a woman, often as a mother or goddess. These images, which circulated in the form of cartoons, newspaper mastheads, posters, and calendars, were for the average Indian citizen the first encounter with the cartographic representation of the nation. The traditional recounting of the introduction of Buddhism from India into Tibet, similarly, is narrated in a clearly anthropomorphic manner. According to tradition, the demoness Rinmo, ruling over Tibet, was particularly resistant to the new faith and had to be subdued. The territory of Tibet was conceived as formed by the vast supine body of the demoness, making the two coextensive and indistinguishable. The king, feeling that the demoness was resisting Buddhism and was waving her arms and legs, decided to place edifices on her land and body in order to pin her down and physically immobilize her. Now, the idea that the body politic has largely lost its appeal for social and political discourse is for two reasons that are mutually at odds. On the one hand, it feels pre-modern and therefore either redundant or irrelevant for the liberal democratic age. On the other, its association with fascist regimes has rendered it politically suspect. It is thus positioned contradictorily as both ineffective and excessively effective. Writing about this somatic undercarriage, Franck Billé notes that an earlier dominant understanding of collective existence in mechanical terms has given way to a vision of the political body as an organism. Whereas a machine is organized from the top down, he explains, a living being is organized from within and self-perpetuating, a better analogy for the reform of the absolute state. As he writes, we are still very far from having renounced organicism in contemporary political discourse. In the germinal text, Ernest Gellner has drawn attention to how the nation-state is commonly imagined as a transhistorical entity in spite of its relatively recent emergence. This paradox is generally justified through the claim that the nation was always there, it was merely asleep. Gellner has argued that his very potent imagery has cloaked the nation-state in a veil of naturalness, thereby transcending the ephemeral beings and generations in which it is transiently incarnated. Intriguingly, the organic undercarriage of this analogy, being asleep, has elicited little scholarly attention, possibly because the somatic metaphor is so pervasive as to have become virtually invisible. Similarly, there remains a well-established tendency to speak of countries as organisms that are born, grow, thrive, decline, and die. Terms such as birth, youth, vigor, decadence, blood, and death commonly refer to the origin, rise, and fall of political nations and empires, cultures, and civilizations. And what I found very interesting in my research is that these fossilized metaphors are accompanied by new ones, suggesting that the body remains a powerful source of analogy. Immunity, the idea of the body being a battle. The notion of immunity, for instance, is originally based in a sociopolitical discourse, not a biological one. It is riddled with images drawn from the sociopolitical sphere of invaders and defenders, hosts and parasites, natives and aliens, and of borders and identities that must be maintained. The body and the political exist as a bipolar image, whose effect is to produce a situation in which there is no literal meaning, nothing but resonances between two images, one biomedical, the other political. What is fascinating, Mark Neocleus writes, is that the concept of immunity, despite being transported into the world of biology, did not lose its foothold in the legal and political world, and that the biological notion of immunity ended up being reinterpreted in all sorts of political ways. We also see very recent coinages. I'm thinking in particular of the metaphor national DNA, which I first heard used by Cindy McCain during the American presidential campaign of 2008, and which has since gained considerable currency. Other bodily metaphors with a definite modern slant include bypass, syndrome, or virus. Mark Neocleus also provides a slew of examples of headlines published in the space of a few months in 2018 and 2019, where the concept of nervous breakdown was applied to Brexit Britain, Spain, China, Russia, Australia, and Ireland, among others. Far from inert, then, sedimented and fossilized metaphors cohabit with other corporeal associations within a broader constellation of organic similes, and metaphors of the state. So having briefly set the stage for the nation-body nexus, the next session of this talk looks at misalignments and disconnects. I'm going to discuss effective investment in lost territories that are no longer included within the state, but which continue to elicit affect and cause what might be termed phantom pains. This was in fact the entry point for this whole project, a casual remark dropped during a workshop, which got me to reflect on the ubiquity of the nation-body nexus and made me want to trace its history, and follow its many reverberations. To clarify, I'm not discussing border disputes here, but territories that have been lost and are understood as such, but which continue to pulse with affect. The geobody has changed, but a surplus, an excess, survives after reorganization of the territory. Sometimes the phantom fades away and the effective contour remolds around the new geobody. At other times, the old geobody may become reactivated, with lost territories erupting into irredentism. In fact, I had to quickly rewrite portions of the manuscript following Russia's full-blown attack on Ukraine. I looked initially at Russia as a post-Soviet entity, though the geographical remit expanded in the course of the research. As Moscow shook off its Soviet heritage, Russians had to come to terms with a much reduced, seemingly mutilated territory and grow accustomed to a new national logo map. The loss of Central Asia, and Kazakhstan in particular, though less traumatic than the loss of Ukraine, made the familiar outline of the Soviet Union completely unrecognizable. Eviscerated of its geographical underbelly, Russia was now an elongated shape, with more republics threatening to break away, including potential enclaves such as Tatarstan, and large parts of Siberia like Yakutia. The cultural and political dominance of Russia over the other republics of the Union throughout the Soviet period had meant that Russia and Soviet Union had often been coextensive and indistinguishable. As a result, the breakup of the Soviet Union proved especially destabilizing for Russia. Like the Russian doll in the image here, many Russians saw their country literally emptied of substance. While reminiscing about the collapse of the Soviet regime in the early 1990s, Natalia, an economic sociologist and a good friend of mine, then based in Blagoveshchensk in the Russian Far East, confided that she had found the territorial dislocation of the Soviet Union extremely distressing. I felt Russia had become so small. Looking at the new state map, I saw how big Kazakhstan was and wondered how Russia would ever be able to go on with half of the country missing. The biggest losses were Kazakhstan, but also Ukraine and Belarus. It was like the country had been mutilated. The loss of Ukraine and Belarus was particularly odd to local people, because that's where most people, at least in the Russian Far East, are originally from. Russians also had to reconcile themselves with the loss of lands long associated with Russian history and culture. The loss of Ukraine, the birthplace of Kievan Rus and fount of modern Russian culture, was especially painful. Despite facing great political and economic sanctions and the possibility of military retaliation, the reintegration of Crimea into Russia's mutilated geobody was clearly a risk worth taking, and one that was largely supported by Russian popular opinion. As Gerard Toll writes, Crimea had held powerful affective appeal to ordinary Russians, both as a storied sacred place in Russian history and as a beloved vacation spot that held happy memories for many people. The Crimean Peninsula was also home to strategic Russian military bases, and unquestionably, the 2014 invasion was geopolitically motivated, as was the war on the rest of Ukraine beginning in 2022. A number of op-eds have made the argument that the West was in part responsible for these invasions because of a reckless enlargement of both NATO and the European Union, causing Russia to feel increasingly encircled. While I find such explanations deeply problematic insofar as they posit Ukraine and other post-Soviet countries as mere pawns rather than autonomous entities with their own aspirations, the prospect that Ukraine might be permanently removed from its geobody was certainly a very real trigger for Russia. Ukraine is effectively and symbolically important for Russia and complementary to its own identity. Reintegrating Ukraine into the original cradle of Russian civilization, whether through merging into a single political entity or through the installation of a regime friendly to Moscow, was perceived as crucial to recompose a nation that had become a mere stump of its former self. Expansion of NATO and the European Union to Ukraine was thus experienced by Russia as an attack on its own body, not that of a neighbor. In other words, not encirclement, but outright mutilation. In its broad range of spatialized cultural memories and political claims, the former Soviet Union provides many illustrations for the kinds of phantoms I want to discuss here. Some of these phantomic spaces, like Ukraine, are potent and unresolved and can erupt into violent warfare. Others merely add a layer of complexity to the unambiguous cartographic representations of the post-Soviet space and index unresolved trauma of the 20th century's political violence. Unsurprisingly, the region of Central and Eastern Europe is unusually rife with phantoms. A 2020 Pew Research survey asked a number of Europeans whether they agreed that there are parts of neighboring countries that really belong to us. A majority of Hungarians, Greeks, Bulgarians, Turks, and Russians agreed that there were. I'll take as main case study today Manchuria, a vast region in Northeast Asia where phantom pains continue to strongly mold affective space. While the international boundaries that bisect it have been amicably settled, Manchuria remains at a crossroads of various empires and the subject of historical claims by their successor states. For Russians, who had a strong presence in the region from 1860 to the 1960s, Manchuria was a place where the Russian Empire's modernity and Europeanness could be showcased, notably through railway technology and high culture. Manchuria remained invested with affect and a ghostly Russian presence. The most important of such nodes is Harbin, a city originally founded by Russians at the turn of the 20th century, as the Chinese Eastern Railway was being built. A Russian-owned enterprise that linked Chita to Vladivostok, the Chinese Eastern Railway brought a large contingent of Russians to the region and led to the founding of Harbin, a Russian city within Chinese territory. For several decades, the city of Harbin remained very Russian, spatially and culturally organized around the St. Sophia Cathedral, one of the largest Christian churches in Asia. Harbin grew significantly after the Bolshevik Revolution to eventually become the largest center of Russian population outside the state of Russia. The streets of Harbin were lined with European-style buildings, and the city was known as the Paris of the East on account of its European presence and rich cultural life. But in the 1930s, following Japanese occupation of Manchuria, most Russians left the city, some for the Soviet Union, others for other cities in China, and eventually abroad. By the early 1960s, only a handful of Russians still remained, most of them elderly. In the course of my research in Blagoveshchensk, whenever I spoke with local residents about Harbin, the city was unfailingly described to me as Russian. Irrespective of the age of the interviewee, the impression generally conveyed was that Harbin had somehow remained part of the Russian cultural topography. Harbin is the nearest sizable Chinese city for Blagoveshchensk residents, and this is one of the reasons why it is an important destination for tourism and education. But the appeal is also due to its perceived Russianness. The sentiments expressed by Irina, a PhD student, echo what a number of other respondents also felt. She said, "I've been to Harbin, I liked it. It's a Russian city, and the Chinese in Harbin have good attitudes towards Russians. Quite a few Chinese there can speak Russian. Some of them have Russian ancestors. There are also Russian schools, a Russian church, and many buildings left from the time Russians lived there. Many Russians also study there. There is a shop called Churin. It used to be a big Russian shop. It's still there, but it's a Chinese trade center now." However, accounts of personal experiences of the city often differed from these descriptions. More often than not, those Harbin residents who spoke Russian were in fact interpreters or tour guides. So with the majority of Harbin residents, Russian visitors had to speak English or Chinese. Interestingly, Chinese residents of Harbin do not share these perceptions of cultural hybridity. For Zhang Min, a young Chinese woman from Harbin studying in Blagoveshchensk, Harbin is not particularly Russian. She concedes that some of the architecture is Russian and that the local beer is also quite similar to Russian beer, but neither she nor her family ever thought of Harbin in those terms. In fact, Harbin is in many ways a quintessentially Chinese city. It is known in China as the city with the purest unaccented Mandarin. Yet for Russians, it remains a space that feels somehow familiar, with the ghostly Russian past that continues to hover. If the original Russian buildings still found in Harbin constitutes only a tiny fraction of the modern city, their central location gives them an undeniable prominence. Many of these buildings, like the Churin department store, have retained only their skeletal structure and have taken on a new Chinese life. This urban palimpsest evoked for many Russians a sense of nostalgia about a bright future that never came to fruition. Indeed, the sense of loss that pervades accounts of Russian Harbin is not simply tied to a past era when Russia was playing an important role in Asia. It also mourns the loss of a promise of a golden future. For Russians, Manchuria was a place where they could stage their own Europeanness and showcase technological advances. By building a railway line that would link European Russia to several seaports in China, Russians were hoping to achieve equality with Europeans. The very founding of Harbin was symbolically just as potent. The emphasis on the cosmopolitanism of the city and the recurrent comparisons with Paris were not casual. They constituted a claim that Russia was just as capable as the rest of Europe to take on the role of colonial ruler. I argue in my book that corporeal metaphors and similes that suffuse discourse about the state are not simply expressive turns of phrase, but that they reveal a conceptual overlap between national map and body map, as well as the extent to which individuals come to perceive the national geocontour as an extension of their own body. Given this close parallel, the experience of territorial loss can elicit affect that discursively resembles the phenomenon known as phantom limbs. These eerie sensations are stubborn ghosts of limbs lost years or even decades before, but not forgotten by the brain. Enduring through the mental map held in the brain circuitry, these sensations continue to be perceived long after the disappearance of their sensory stimuli. Well known in popular culture, the concept of phantom pain has proven a potent metaphor for issues of unresolved territorial loss. The phantom limb phenomenon was first medically observed as early as 1545 by French surgeon Ambroise Paré, He was a battlefield surgeon and one of the fathers of modern surgery. But it would be another 300 years before a medical article was published on this unusual phenomenon. The current medical consensus is that phantom sensations are due to a discrepancy between the actual physical body and the body map held in the brain. Recent research suggests that the occurrence of phantom limb pain is more complex, involves both somatic and psychological factors, and is also tied to the ways and speed with which the limb has been lost. The phenomenon does not occur, for example, in patients who lose their limb progressively due to diseases such as leprosy. This would appear to confirm the hypothesis that the patient can gradually learn to register and assimilate the corporeal changes through visual feedback. The centrality of bodily integrity resonates here strongly with the importance of lost territories in the imaginary of the nation-state. The corporeal discourse in which territorial loss is woven is surprisingly consistent, even in contexts as desperate as Russia, India, or South America. The point I want to make here is that territorial loss is discussed and largely experienced as a mutilation, as a loss that is affective and visceral, not cartographic, abstract, and disembodied. Of course, the struggle to come to terms with a new logo map cannot be assumed to be uniform across time and place, nor indeed to be experienced in the same way by all individuals in a given nation-state. Just as individuals show variation in their response to the loss of a limb, some nation-states will integrate a new national outline comparatively quickly, while for others, the former logo map will continue to dominate self-representations and imaginations for decades or longer. These national differences echo the variety of responses shown by individuals following the loss of a limb. In addition to security, economic, and geopolitical concerns, differences are also tied to the ways in which the loss has occurred, the perception of trauma, and the affective and fetishistic investment in the wound. It is crucial to bear in mind that the state is not one but multiple, constituted of diverse parts and actors. Consequently, as Elizabeth Dunn phrases very nicely, the building of a new state unspools over time and in unpredictable ways. What is perhaps easier to predict is that the geobody, i.e. the corporal imaginary of the state, is probably here to stay. The examples of new metaphors I've mentioned earlier suggest that the body continues to be a powerful source of analogies, and that the body-state nexus remains dominant. The outline of that geobody, the logo map, is similarly virtually ubiquitous, sometimes as a branding element in the case of France or Texas, sometimes as a spatial claim in the case of newly created states. Now, of course, the logo map is not, and nor are borders for that matter, a faithful representation of the actual working of the state. It speaks to an imaginary of the state, an imaginary with very potent social and political consequences. Through its simplicity, the logo map offers visual clarity and implied stability in a context of complex global processes, such as the neoliberal economy, rise of a supranational billionaire class, etc., where the national body appears to be fraying at the edges. The logo map, clear and dichotomous, us, them, inside, outside, offers clarity and also a sense of bodily integrity. As a container, it holds together the imagined community of the nation. Similarly, the body analogy should not distract us from the fact that the Westphalian model is aspirational and that organicist metaphors buttress it in order to convey a sense of physicality and stability. The irony, as I discuss in the book, through the lens of phantom limbs and prosthetics, and particularly in the last chapter on monsters and entanglements, is that the body itself is culturally constructed. Yet, despite their limitations, the two components of the body territory doublet mutually reinforce and reify one another. There are, of course, limitations in the deployment of the logo map, as well as exceptions to the organicist metaphor. Some nation-states, for instance, rarely use the logo map to depict themselves. In the US context, logo maps tend to be about individual states, and mostly those that have visual force. Logo maps about the entire country are excessively rare, as rare these days as a national sense of unity. The UK also rarely uses a logo map. In addition to the difficulty of representing the state as a logo map, given that it involves various concatenated legal entities, both within the state and adjacent to it, such as crown dependencies, like the Isle of Man, Guernsey and Jersey, overseas territories and Commonwealth realms, the UK's own territorial arrangement of 4 components, England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, across 2 main islands, adds further complexity. Perhaps out of reluctance to split Ireland, the UK rarely uses logo map, opting instead for a flag. We can see similar incipient developments elsewhere, notably with the French hexagon, represented in more stylized ways in the colors of the flag. Unlike a logo map aligned on an ideal of territorial container, these abstract logos offer membership to a more geographically malleable entity, aligned with civic and participatory rather than ethnic forms of belonging. There are nonetheless dangers inherent to such visual practices in that they obscure further the control that states such as Britain or France continue to exert on countries only nominally post-colonial, thereby rendering completely invisible the numerous territorial specks and confetti that bestow a truly global footprint on these former colonial powers. In any case, these shifts are unlikely to displace entrenched visualizations of the state as a logo map. Alternative visuals in the form of a flag or stylized logo map are symptomatic of privilege insofar as they are largely available to states that do not need reiterative emphasis on their outline. By contrast, in countries where borders are unstable or felt to be under threat, such as India and Pakistan or Israel and Palestine, logo maps remain ubiquitous, and incorrect mapping may result in hefty fines, or worse. Forecasts of a weakening or supersession of the logo map by alternatives are thus premature and unconvincing. What we can expect instead is a widening of the breach between representations of the state and its operations between imaginary and actuality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank. That was really interesting. Yeah, so I would like to open up the floor for questions. So if there are any questions, please raise your hand so you can ask a question yourself. And if that's not possible, it's also possible to put the question into the chat and I can read it out loud. So yeah, please, if you have a question, raise your hand. Starting off with Marco.
Thank you, Frank. I mean, perfect time, 40.
Yes, I tried to.
You were a bit worried. Sorry, I hope we didn't rush you. But anyhow,
I just snipped a few bits, not necessary.
Yeah. Can I go back to the points? Because you start with the assumption that you use the nation and the state interchangeably, so as so you don't differentiate. Although obviously, historically, these should be differentiated. So let me push a bit on this, and let me ask the question. So because for what I understood, the whole idea of the mutilation, the lost limb, all the issues with irredentism are somehow associated with the fact that the state has a nation, right? It's the nation that, as you said, the state is no longer there, but the nation still projects itself on those territories, right? And that sense for longing of something which is lost. So I do perfectly then understand how the corporeal as a metaphor works for the nation state. But my question is, if you take away the nation, so if you think about a time in which the nation was not yet present in the way the state was conceptualized, etc., what is the role of the corporeal? What kind of work does the corporeal in a historic time, in which the nation was not present? Does it make sense? Is it clear?
Yeah, I'm not sure I fully understand your question. I just want to address the interchangeability. I just use that as a shortcut in my talk, is I differentiate them fully.
Yeah.
The state and the nation. I do not say they're the same thing. They just sometimes are used interchangeably, and that says a lot about how we use them. There's some confusion there, but there are two different things. Yes. So why is it like before the state? So yeah, can you repeat your question? I just want to make sure that I get it.
Before the state became the nation state, because when is the nation state, the role of the corporeal is quite very much understandable, and I do see the analytical purchase of using the corporeal as a way of projecting that sense of longing for a territory which is no longer part of the territory of the state, but still part of the territory of the nation. Thinking about Finland, you have the example of Finland with just one arm, because the other arm was cut off during, where Russia is now, is just part of Russia. So if we go back to a time in which the state did not have the nation, so just the state, so talking about, I don't know, the 1400, so before the nation came to, so what would be the analytical purchase of mobilizing the metaphor of the corporeal in a time in which the nation was not around?
Okay. Okay, so what I do in the work is to trace a corporeal idea that is linked to space, to the space. So the space maybe is not a state yet. The space revolves around the body of the monarch. So there's this kind of it's an extension of the body of the monarch, right? And it's only when we have it's only when we reach the time when we have the state that becomes kind of the formation of states, then that shifts to a different form of corporeal imagining, which is no longer tied to the body of the monarch, but then tied to the body of people, right? Then we have examples of Finland, for instance, that was kind of aspirational, when you see, well, this is the outline of the state, and therefore the nation should be contained within it, and therefore there's like, so the one arm is missing, kind of giving the sense that the nation should be fully included within the state, should be self-contained, and then if it's not, then there is something missing. And what is interesting for me, the missing bit is described in corporeal terms. It could be described differently. You could easily have a map of Finland and say, well, this bit is not included, it should be part of it. Why do we use the idea of the body to do that? That's the kind of driving question for me. Another example was Belgium. There's a map of a lion that represents Belgium. Belgium did not exist yet, but it was again kind of trying to summon it into existence through a natural body. So not a personal body. I mean, not an individual this time, but an animal, which is also kind of very, very common. There's a lot of zoomorphic maps. So kind of the same thing. It's like it's taking a corporeal vehicle for this claim, which doesn't have to be. It could be done in a different way. You could just say, well, Belgians are here. You could just show a map, and they should be within the same country. The fact that you have to describe it in a bodily vehicle is kind of interesting. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, I do think it's particularly interesting that time, exactly as you say, in which the body of the monarch is translated and becomes the body of the people, the classic figures, the Leviathan. Yeah, I think, yeah, I think personally I would like to research more that, but I don't think I would have the time. But that passage for me is particularly interesting because it's before the nation. Then when the nation steps in, it's clear. But that passage, when the body of the monarch becomes the body of the state, and the state is no longer the monarch, so that would be quite fascinating and interesting. But yeah, I don't want to take much more time here because I see there is another question. Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Frank.
Yeah, I see a question from Asmir. You go ahead first, and then there's also some questions in the chat.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, Frank. Great talk. Thank you again. So I know I've been following your work, and I know you've been talking about the Soma for a while now, from territorial phantom pains to topology writings, right? So I was wondering, whenever you're talking about territorial phantom pains, you're talking about somatic states or the imaginary, you have claimed that space is multisensorial, right? So I was wondering, how do you see the space not just as somatic, but also the psychic aspect of it, the cognitive aspect of it? because when you're talking about phantom pains, it's not only the soma, but also the imaginary, the cognitive, the psyche of it.
Okay. Do you have like an example you're thinking of, just to see if I can just hang something more concrete to your question? Like, are you kind of, is that, I don't know, something, a particular case you're thinking of, or?
So it
I mean,
comes from, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Sorry, I'm just trying to gather my thought while you're.
So it comes from another paper that Virginia Bloom and Anna Seiko wrote about the psyche of the topology. So I'm reading your paper of the soma of the topology and psyche of the topology, and trying to connect how the psyche and the soma comes together, not just the soma, but the psyche. Because when you're talking about phantom pains, yes, the pain is real, but it is in the psyche, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I wonder, have you thought about it, or are you thinking anything, or like, what's your take on it?
Well, so okay, so I'm hoping I'm answering your question precisely. If I'm not, just let me know. But what the point I want to make in my work is that the body is used as a way to naturalize the idea of the state and the nation. But the idea of the body itself is constructed. So there's really kind of a fine line between the body and the psyche. They actually, it's the way you imagine the body, right? So it's just like the phantom painting may be a good example of that. That is, it's just something that you experience physically, but it's not just a physical thing. It's also, it goes through the psyche. So actually, there's a very kind of fine line between the two. Where there's a kind of a mix between the two. It's not really. Does that? Am I getting at what you're trying to ask me?
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of topology, and that article was like amazing, which I cite all the time, but yes, I'm using topology differently. It's my new project. Yeah, this is, yeah, so I don't know. Do you want to, is that is that really a good answer? I'm not sure.
Yeah, thank you for yeah.
All right, great. I think there are two more questions in the chat from Michael. So his first question is, there's some interesting work in political psychology on the role of borders in generating a sense of ontological security for majority members. And I wondered if you might comment on that. Yeah, so maybe start with that question.
So can I see the question? Just like
yeah, it's in the chat.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. 1 second. Corporeal. I'm not sure. I am not sure. I'm not sure that's exactly what that kind of. Would you have like examples? Again, it's just like it would help me.
If Michael is in the chat, he has a microphone, maybe he can elaborate a bit. I'm not sure if it's
Of borders. So, right. I mean, it's like, if I understand, I mean, this kind of makes me think of the work of Wendy Brown, for instance, who looks at borders and what they and argues that borders are there to give a sense of security for in response to the state kind of becoming, I mean, the sense that the state is becoming etiolated or kind of losing force, which I do not necessarily agree with. I mean, that's what I think the erection of borders is doing, is kind of projecting a sense of the container, something that is, we find very difficult, I think, to think beyond. It's kind of an important category in the way we think of the state, even though it's again a very simplistic kind of a take on what the state is and how the state functions. But it's something that kind of matters. So I guess that's maybe, is that okay? So I can see your response, Michael. Does that answer Does that answer your thing also about the bodies and body movements I used to represent a nation? Yes, actually, I talk about that in the book. It's like also, so this, I have a chapter on this, a kind of a really kind of looking at the entanglement of the state and the nation, and how the nation is projected in terms of bodily as well. Like football is one of the examples I give. Yes, so I mean, I don't know how. I mean, I'm not a football fan, so I wouldn't be able to say very much about it. But kind of the sense of the, a certain essence of the person, like the fiery, I don't know, Mediterranean, the kind of cold German, or all this kind of stuff, and this kind of helps kind of gel together this sense of nation that again is contained within this space. But I'm not sure again that I'm really answering your question.
Yeah, I think I see a thanks in the chat, so
Maybe.
yeah.
Sorry, Frank. We give you a hard time here.
I know,
we
they're
should
really
be
kind of
polite.
difficult
We should be
questions.
generous. We should be welcoming. And look what we are doing here. It's a mess. I'm not gonna invite anyone.
No. I'm glad for this question because they, they're gonna keep me thinking. I'll probably have an answer later. That's the way I kind of.
Yeah. No,
it's always slow for me to respond.
No.
So it's not that I'm kind of not taking them on board. I'm gonna think more about them. So I might have a great answer later. But no, I'm very grateful for this because I think I'm speaking to a different crowd maybe. So it's also I'm getting kind of questions that maybe I do not expect or not, kind of I hadn't really quite thought in those terms. So no, I'm very pleased about them.
No, if I may, sorry, because I'm actually saying, so for me, it might be also quite difficult, if I may say, just, to respond so quickly, because you might not have an answer. I mean, yeah, it's food for thought, so it's going to be put there. But if I may, Johanna, can I ask a further question? It's not really a question, but it's just a matter of where you see is the next step. So based on what you have done so far, your work do you see any continuation, or you have what you had to say, you said, so that's it, you move to another project, or you see something from here that, okay, on this basis, that's the next step I'm going to?
So actually, this is kind of the second book in a 3-book project. The first one was the one on volume. So it's kind of, they're all kind of linked to the idea of the state, the idea of the imaginary of the state, and space. So the first one was on, the conceptualizing the state as a volume rather than a surface, but this kind of the second one then is this one, and the third one is on topology. So they're kind of all linked in some way, but they're kind of also distinct. I may write more about the somatic. I think as you finish something. I mean, I spent a lot of time writing this book, thinking about it for 10 years. So I feel in some way this chapter is completed. I've said what I had to say. I don't see this book as a kind of a final say on the matter. I see more as a kind of an opening and hoping people get inspired and maybe do something different with it. But there is very possible that I come across something and I think, oh, I need to write about this, and then write something else about that particular topic. Or maybe then when I finish the third book, try to write a book that would kind of condense the main elements of the 3 books, and then using this time also to think further about these different aspects of the work.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, great. Thank you.
Well, thank you again for inviting me, and sorry for being not very good with answering those questions.
No, I think it was great. Are there any more questions remaining? I don't think so, right? All right. Well, Frank, then I would like to thank you very much for giving this talk. I found it very fascinating. It's a new topic for me, so definitely a lot to think about and to reflect on. So for everybody else, thanks for showing up and participating. And if you would like, you can rewatch the seminar on the website of the Loughborough University Nationalism Network. And yeah, we hope to see you in the next one. And thanks again to Frank for the amazing talk.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Frank, thank you. I'm going to